In the silence of a crescent moon night, a 12-year-old boy stood on the balcony of Topkapi Palace, his gaze fixed far beyond the Bosphorus, to the west. His name was Mehmed, the son of Sultan Murad II. But even at that young age, he wasn't just another Ottoman prince. He was already dreaming of something that had eluded sultans, emperors, and caliphs for centuries: the city of Constantinople. To most, it was just a city, walled, mighty, and ancient. But to Mehmed, it was the unfinished prophecy, the golden prize foretold in the traditions of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, who said, "Verily, you shall conquer Constantinople. What a wonderful leader will her leader be, and what a wonderful army will that army be." That single narration ignited a flame inside him that would burn for years. While his peers were busy with poetry or hunting, Mehmed was consumed by maps, battle strategies, and the history of Rome and Byzantium. He studied Alexander the Great, Hannibal, and Caesar, but unlike them, he did so not just for glory, but because he believed he was destined for something greater. His tutors taught him astronomy, theology, logic, and multiple languages: Arabic, Persian, Latin, Greek. He wasn't preparing to rule just an empire, he was preparing to reshape history. But the road to greatness was anything but smooth. At just 12, he was handed the throne when his father abdicated, believing the empire needed fresh energy. But the court was divided, the military was unsure, and the enemies of the Ottomans, like the Hungarians and the Byzantines, sensed weakness. Young Mehmed's first reign was shaky, and his father was forced to return to the throne when threats loomed too large. Humiliated but not broken, Mehmed didn't see this as failure, he saw it as preparation. He returned to his studies with even more fire. Constantinople, with its massive walls and legends of invincibility, remained fixed in his heart. While others thought the city was untouchable, Mehmed began to see its weaknesses. It was no longer the capital of a mighty empire, it was a relic, protected by thick walls and a few allies. If the Ottomans could unite their resources, build a powerful navy, and use technology wisely, the impossible could be done. Then came the moment that changed everything: Sultan Murad II died. At the age of 19, Mehmed ascended the throne once more. But this time, he was no longer a boy. He was a man with a plan, and nothing would stop him. One of his first acts, he began constructing a fortress on the European side of the Bosphorus, Rumeli Hisari, just a stone's throw away from Constantinople's northern walls. It was a message, loud and clear: "I am coming." The Byzantines watched nervously. They had heard of Mehmed's obsession, but they underestimated him. To them, he was just another ambitious sultan, one of many who had tried and failed. They didn't know that Mehmed was not just coming with swords and soldiers, he was coming with something they had never faced before: massive cannons, revolutionary war tactics, and the burning conviction that he was the chosen one to fulfill a centuries-old prophecy. In his chambers, Mehmed pored over blueprints, corresponded with engineers from across the Muslim world, and commissioned Orban, a Christian cannon maker from Hungary, to build him a weapon the world had never seen. And in the heart of his plans, always, was the city he called Constantinople. To his advisors, he was calm and calculating. But in private, his heart raced with every day that passed. The walls of Constantinople had stood for over 1,000 years. No army had breached them. But Mehmed was not afraid of legends, he intended to become one. By the time winter faded and spring arrived in 1453, Mehmed's dream was no longer a whisper in the dark. It was a roaring storm, and its eye was fixed on the greatest prize of the medieval world. The boy who once stared at the stars was now the man who would make the world watch him reshape history. For over 1,000 years, Constantinople stood like a crowned jewel, untouched by time and untouched by enemy hands. It had survived invasions, earthquakes, betrayals, and sieges. Its towering walls, known as the Theodosian Walls, were considered impenetrable, a triumph of engineering and a symbol of divine protection. Many armies had tried to bring the city down. All had failed. But in 1453, something changed. The city was still proud, but it was no longer powerful. The once great Byzantine Empire had withered into a fragment of its former self, little more than the city and a few surrounding territories. Their population had dwindled, their coffers were nearly empty, and their political influence was a shadow of what it used to be. And yet, they held on to the belief that Constantinople would never fall. They were wrong. On the opposite shore, Sultan Mehmed II, now just 21 years old, had been preparing for this moment his entire life. But what he brought to the battlefield wasn't just brute force, it was vision. Mehmed had studied every failed attempt to take Constantinople. He knew that earlier sieges lacked either naval power or advanced artillery. So, he made sure he had both. He commissioned the building of a fleet of ships and, more importantly, a superweapon, a massive cannon so large it took 60 oxen and hundreds of men to move. Designed by the Hungarian engineer Orban, this cannon could fire stone balls weighing over 500 kilograms. The Byzantines were alarmed. Emperor Constantine XI knew what was coming. He had only around 7,000 defenders, including foreign mercenaries. The Ottomans had over 80,000 soldiers. The numbers were terrifying, but Constantine was not a man to surrender. He sealed the gates, reinforced the walls, and prayed. On April 6, 1453, Mehmed's forces began the siege. From the very first day, it was unlike anything Constantinople had seen. The great cannon fired thunderously, pounding the city's ancient walls. The Ottomans launched waves of attacks. Yet the defenders fought with valor, pushing them back time and time again. The walls cracked, but they did not crumble. But Mehmed was a patient commander. He knew this wasn't a battle of days, it was a war of attrition. Day by day, the pressure mounted. Then came the most daring move of the siege. The Ottomans dragged over 70 ships over land, across greased logs, bypassing the great chain that blocked the Golden Horn. When the defenders awoke to see Turkish ships behind their sea walls, panic set in. The city's defenders were now attacked from two sides, land and sea. Still, Constantinople held on. The weeks passed. Food began to run short. Morale wavered. Yet Emperor Constantine led by example, fighting alongside his men on the walls, refusing to flee. The Christian world watched but did not come to help. Europe was too busy with its own conflicts. The Byzantines were on their own. Then came May 29, the final assault. In the dark hours before dawn, Mehmed gave the order. Drums pounded like thunder. Waves of Ottoman soldiers surged forward. The first wave was meant to exhaust the defenders. The second pressed harder. The third included Mehmed's elite janissaries, and this time, cracks began to appear, not just in the walls, but in the spirit of the defenders. A small postern gate, Kirkaporta, was left open in the confusion. The Ottomans stormed through. The city was breached. In the chaos, Emperor Constantine XI fought bravely and vanished into legend, his body never found. The ancient city, once the center of the Eastern Roman Empire, was now in Ottoman hands. At midday, Mehmed entered Hagia Sophia, the greatest church in the Christian world, and offered his prayers. The building, untouched, was transformed into a mosque, not destroyed, but preserved as a symbol of victory and respect. Mehmed did not allow total destruction. He stopped the looting by afternoon and ordered protection for civilians. He was no longer just Mehmed II. He was now Mehmed the Conqueror, Fatih Sultan Mehmed, a name that would echo through the centuries. Constantinople had fallen. The impossible had been achieved. And the world would never be the same again. When we think of ancient warfare, we imagine swords clashing, arrows flying, and soldiers charging. But Sultan Mehmed II's conquest of Constantinople wasn't just about brute force. It was about strategy, innovation, and one secret weapon that changed everything: gunpowder. Mehmed wasn't just a warrior. He was a student of history, engineering, and statecraft. He knew that previous sieges had failed because they relied on old methods. So he didn't just come to Constantinople with numbers, he came with a revolutionary mindset. His first and most terrifying tool: the super cannon. This cannon wasn't ordinary. It was called the Basilica, and it was massive, some say over 27 feet long. It could fire a stone projectile the size of a car, and the sound of its blast echoed for miles. Built by a Hungarian engineer named Orban, who first offered his services to the Byzantines, they couldn't afford him. This cannon was a monster of medieval warfare. It took weeks to transport it from Edirne to Constantinople, dragged by oxen and teams of men. When it finally arrived, it wasn't just a weapon, it was a message. The Ottomans began pounding the Theodosian walls day and night. These walls had stood for over 1,000 years. 3 layers thick, they had repelled every army that came before. But nothing like this had ever been used against them. Each blast shook the ground. Stones the size of boulders slammed into the defenses. Sections cracked. Some crumbled. Though the defenders rushed to repair them every night, they couldn't keep up forever. But Mehmed wasn't relying on the cannon alone. He understood that walls, no matter how strong, have limits. So he ordered a second tactic: tunneling. Underground, away from the roar of battle, his men dug tunnels beneath the walls. These were meant to collapse foundations or allow silent entry into the city. It was ancient siege warfare, dirty, dangerous, and clever. The Byzantines, however, weren't passive. They listened carefully. Using buckets of water to detect underground movement, they discovered the digging. Counter-tunnels were built. Fierce underground battles took place in the dark, with torches and blades. Some tunnels collapsed, burying soldiers alive. Others were flooded or set ablaze with sulfur smoke. It became a war above and below. But Mehmed didn't stop there. He noticed that the Golden Horn, a natural harbor protecting the city's northern wall, was blocked by a massive iron chain. This chain had thwarted enemy ships for centuries. Many thought it was impenetrable. So Mehmed changed the rules. One night, under the cover of darkness, he launched one of the boldest moves in siege history. He moved his ships over land. Using greased logs and wooden planks, he had more than 70 warships dragged over the hills, through forests, and down into the Golden Horn, bypassing the chain entirely. When the Byzantines awoke to see an Ottoman fleet behind their sea walls, panic swept through the city. The defenders were now being attacked from land and sea. It was a masterstroke of logistics and deception. The Byzantines tried to set fire to the ships with Greek fire. They launched sudden counterattacks. But Mehmed had momentum, and he pressed harder. Still, despite the cannon blasts, the tunnels, and the surprise naval assault, the city held. It refused to surrender. So Mehmed turned to yet another secret weapon: psychological warfare. He used drums to intimidate, fire arrows to create chaos at night, and constant attacks to exhaust the defenders. His forces took shifts, always keeping pressure, always hammering the city. Every move was calculated. He even used spies to gather information from inside the walls. But the final blow was not just military. It was also symbolic. Mehmed gave speeches to his men. He reminded them that Constantinople was the heart of an empire, the gateway between East and West, and the fulfillment of the Prophet Muhammad's peace be upon him prophecy: "Verily, you shall conquer Constantinople." What a wonderful leader will her leader be, and what a wonderful army will that army be. With this prophecy burning in their hearts, the Ottomans were not just fighting a war, they were fulfilling destiny. Everything led to the final assault on May 29, 1453. All the tunnels, the cannons, the strategies, they were the storm before the strike. That morning, Mehmed unleashed his full might. The walls were trembling, smoke filled the sky, and from the chaos emerged the final breach. Constantinople, the city that couldn't fall, finally did. And it didn't fall because of sheer numbers. It fell because one young sultan brought firepower, tactics, courage, and vision, a combination the ancient walls had never seen before. The morning of May 29, 1453, began with a strange silence. For 50 days, the ground had shaken with cannon fire, men had screamed, drums had echoed, and the air had been thick with smoke and dust. But on this morning, silence. The defenders of Constantinople, tired, battered, and hopelessly outnumbered, stood watch on their fractured walls. The young Emperor Constantine XI knew what was coming. Everyone did. This wasn't just another attack. This was the final storm. Just before dawn, Sultan Mehmed II stood on a ridge outside the city. At only 21 years old, he was about to etch his name into history. His army, nearly 80,000 strong, stood ready in position. They were divided into waves. Each one had a specific purpose. Each one had a mission. And they were all fueled by a single truth: history was about to change forever. As the sky began to turn gray, the order was given. The first wave charged. These were the irregulars, wild warriors from the outer parts of the empire. Many had little armor, but their task wasn't to win. It was to exhaust the defenders, to force them to waste arrows, to wear down their strength. The Byzantines fought back fiercely, hurling stones, boiling oil, and Greek fire. Blood ran down the walls. Screams filled the air. But when that wave fell back, another rose behind them, stronger, more organized. The Anatolian troops now stormed forward, hurling ladders against the walls, shouting battle cries that shook the very stones. The defenders, already exhausted, fought like men possessed. Even Emperor Constantine himself was seen in armor, sword in hand, leading from the front. Then came the final blow, the Janissaries. These were not ordinary soldiers. They were the elite, hand-picked warriors of the Sultan, disciplined, fearless, and terrifyingly effective. Their march was silent, their advance was slow, and when they struck, it was with precision. As they neared the weakest point, the gate of St. Romanus, already torn open by cannon fire, a strange accident occurred that sealed the city's fate. A small postern gate near the Kirkoporta had been left unlocked. Some Ottoman scouts spotted it and slipped inside, raising the crescent banner atop the wall. The sight of that flag panicked the defenders. Rumors spread that the Ottomans had already breached the city from within. Morale collapsed, and then the Janissaries surged through the main gate. They clashed with what remained of the Byzantine force. The streets turned into rivers of blood. Arrows flew. Blades tore through armor. There was no retreat, only survival, or death. Constantine XI, the last Roman emperor, removed his royal garments, raised his sword, and charged into battle one final time. He was never seen again. Inside the city, chaos reigned. Civilians ran through the streets. Churches were packed with people praying, hiding, crying. The great Hagia Sophia, once the jewel of Christendom, was filled with thousands who sought divine protection. But the storm could not be stopped. Ottoman troops burst through the gates. Some looted, some searched, others simply marveled. They had entered a city that had stood for over 1,100 years. For the first time, Constantinople belonged to the East. But Sultan Mehmed, when he finally entered, came not as a savage, but as a conqueror with vision. He rode straight to Hagia Sophia, dismounted, and walked across its sacred floor. He ordered that it be converted into a mosque, but the building itself was preserved. He forbade the destruction of the city. He spared scholars, architects, scientists. He knew that if Constantinople was to be the capital of an empire, it needed more than soldiers, it needed culture, knowledge, and peace. Still, the cost was unimaginable. The final breach had taken hours, but it had cost thousands of lives. Blood stained every stone. The screams of that day echoed in the hearts of the survivors for generations. The Roman Empire, born in the days of Caesar, had drawn its final breath. But from that chaos, a new era was born. Sultan Mehmed, now known as Mehmed the Conqueror, had taken the crown jewel of two worlds. He renamed it Istanbul. It became the heart of the Ottoman Empire, the bridge between Asia and Europe, Islam and the West, past and future. The fall of Constantinople wasn't just the end of a city, it was the end of an age. And it all came down to one final breach. The smoke had barely cleared. The cries of war had faded into silence. The city that had once stood as the crown jewel of Christendom now lay broken, but not for long. Sultan Mehmed II, just 21 years old, did not let victory become destruction. He stood among the rubble, looking not at what had fallen, but at what could rise. To him, Constantinople was not just a conquered city. It was a dream fulfilled, a new beginning, a capital in the making. He rode slowly through the ruined streets, not as a wild invader, but as a ruler with a vision. Where others saw burnt homes and broken stones, Mehmed saw a future empire's beating heart. The first thing he did was declare the city the new capital of the Ottoman Empire. He renamed it Istanbul, though it would still be called Constantinople in many texts for centuries. But in the Ottoman heart, this was now the city of Islam, knowledge, culture, and power. He began rebuilding immediately. Churches were restored or repurposed. Markets reopened. Public baths, mosques, and schools began to rise from the ruins. Instead of wiping the city clean, he carefully preserved its essence. The great Hagia Sophia, once the largest church in the world, became a grand mosque, but its architecture was untouched. It remained a symbol, now shared between civilizations. Mehmed knew that a capital could not thrive on ruins alone. He invited people from all corners of the empire, Greeks, Armenians, Jews, Arabs, Turks, to settle in Istanbul. He promised safety and opportunity. Many came. Within a decade, the city that had bled on its final day was once again alive with color, language, and trade. He turned Istanbul into a melting pot. Languages mixed in the markets. Prayers rose from minarets and homes alike. Artisans, scholars, and merchants brought new life to the ancient streets. Mosques were built beside ancient columns. Libraries were founded in the same neighborhoods as old Byzantine palaces. But it wasn't just physical rebuilding that made the aftermath so powerful, it was what Mehmed chose to keep. He preserved Byzantine law books, translated Greek scientific texts, and protected scholars who had once served the Roman Empire. He knew power wasn't just in swords, it was in knowledge. And he wanted Istanbul to shine not only with military strength, but with intellectual brilliance. Under his reign, the city became a hub of learning and science. Schools, madrasas, were established. Architects from all over were called to reshape the skyline. And slowly, a new identity emerged, one that honored both its Islamic soul and Roman roots. The economy boomed. Trade routes flowed through Istanbul, bringing spices from the east, silk from China, gold from Africa, and goods from Europe. The Ottoman navy expanded. The empire's heart was no longer just on land, but at sea. And Istanbul was its anchor. Culturally, the city became a canvas for art, poetry, calligraphy, and architecture. The Ottomans were not content with copying. They built a style of their own, blending Persian elegance, Arab design, and Roman structure. The skyline began to rise with domes and minarets, the echoes of the Adhan blending with the footsteps of merchants and soldiers. But not everything was peaceful. The scars of conquest lingered. Many Byzantines mourned their lost world. The Christian empire had fallen. Some fled, others adapted. Tensions sometimes simmered, but Mehmed's policy was firm: unity through tolerance. As long as people paid their taxes and respected Ottoman rule, they could keep their religion, traditions, and language. This created something rare: a diverse empire held together not just by force, but by function. And Istanbul was its center. Years passed, and the young conqueror aged into a wise ruler. His city, once cracked and bleeding, now pulsed with energy. Travelers described it as the gateway to heaven, a place where East met West in perfect balance. The aftermath of the fall was not just about stones and walls, it was about identity. The Ottomans had not just taken a city, they had inherited a legacy. And instead of destroying it, they transformed it. And so, the story of Constantinople didn't end in blood. It continued in brilliance. It passed through the hands of one empire into another, but the fire of civilization kept burning. It burned in the eyes of a young sultan. It burned in the hearts of those who rebuilt. And it still burns today, in the city we call Istanbul. The fall of Constantinople wasn't just a moment in history, it was a thunderclap that echoed through two worlds. In Europe, the news spread like wildfire. Churches tolled their bells in mourning. From Rome to Paris, from Venice to Vienna, one question whispered through the courts, cathedrals, and marketplaces: how could the queen of cities fall? For over 1,000 years, Constantinople had been more than a city. It had been a symbol, the last stronghold of the Roman Empire, the fortress that had stood through crusades, plagues, sieges, and time itself. Its thick Theodosian walls were believed to be impenetrable. Emperors had once ruled the known world from its golden throne. And now, it belonged to a 21-year-old Muslim sultan. Europe was not prepared. For centuries, Christian Europe had seen Constantinople as a buffer, a shield against the rising power of the Islamic world. Its fall shattered that illusion. It wasn't just a military loss. It was a psychological earthquake. Pope Nicholas V declared days of prayer and fasting. Priests in Italian cities preached that the end of days was near. The mighty walls of Christendom had cracked. Some whispered of divine punishment. Others feared the Turkish tide would flood into Europe next. And they had reason to worry. Sultan Mehmed II, now titled the Conqueror, had already made it clear that he wasn't done. The fall of Constantinople was just the beginning of a broader vision, an empire that stretched across east and west. In the Italian states, merchants panicked. Constantinople had been a central hub of Mediterranean trade. Venice and Genoa feared losing their lucrative routes. Diplomats scrambled to open channels with the Ottomans, trying to protect business, if not faith. But not all of Europe mourned. Some saw opportunity. Renaissance scholars, especially in Italy, welcomed Byzantine intellectuals fleeing the city. These refugees brought ancient Greek manuscripts and knowledge that would help ignite the flames of the Renaissance. So while Constantinople burned, a new dawn of science, philosophy, and art began to rise in Europe, sparked by the very fall they mourned. Meanwhile, in the Islamic world, the reaction was just as powerful, but different. From Cairo to Baghdad, from Damascus to the far deserts of Arabia, Muslim poets, scholars, and rulers celebrated. They didn't just see a city's fall. They saw a prophecy fulfilled. Many believed that Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, had foretold the conquest of Constantinople. The hadith was well known. You shall conquer Constantinople. What a wonderful leader will her leader be, and what a wonderful army will that army be. Muslim scholars quoted these words with awe. To them, Mehmed wasn't just a sultan, he was the one foretold, the fulfiller of prophecy. His victory wasn't just political, it was spiritual. In the Ottoman world, poems were written praising his name. Coins were minted to mark the moment. Islamic scholars traveled to Istanbul to witness the transformation. For many Muslims, this was a sign that the Islamic world was entering a golden age once more. But even within the Islamic world, there was a quiet ripple of concern. The Mamluks in Egypt watched the rising Ottoman star with unease. The Safavids in Persia saw the growing empire as a future rival. Unity under Islam was celebrated, but competition for dominance had just begun. Still, the conquest became a rallying cry. It inspired a surge in morale across Muslim lands. For centuries, Islamic scholars had debated the meaning of the hadith. Now, it had come true. A city long seen as unconquerable had been taken, not with brute force alone, but with intelligence, patience, and divine favor. In both Christian and Muslim worlds, one thing became clear. The balance of power had shifted. Europe now had to face a new superpower at its gates. The Islamic world had found a leader with not only ambition, but the ability to carry it through. And in the middle of it all stood a city, bloodied, broken, but reborn. Constantinople, now Istanbul, was no longer just a place. It was a message that even the strongest can fall. That empires rise where others crumble. That history bends, when vision meets will. As the dust of battle settled and the call to prayer echoed from Hagia Sophia for the first time, Sultan Mehmed II stood at the heart of a city that had seen 1,000 years of emperors. But for Mehmed, the conquest of Constantinople wasn't the end of a campaign. It was the beginning of something far greater. He wasn't just a warrior, he was a visionary. From the moment he rode through the shattered gates, he saw more than ruins and rubble. He saw potential. He didn't want to destroy Constantinople. He wanted to transform it. First, he protected the Christian population. He invited back those who had fled during the siege and appointed a new patriarch, ensuring that Christians could worship freely. This was no ordinary act of mercy, it was strategy. Mehmed knew that to rule a vast and diverse empire, he needed all its people. Next, he brought in Muslims, Jews, and others from across his realm to repopulate the city. Craftsmen, scholars, poets, merchants, he wanted Istanbul to become the beating heart of a multicultural empire. And it worked. Under Mehmed's rule, Istanbul didn't just recover. It flourished. Palaces, mosques, schools, and gardens rose from the ashes. He made it the capital of his empire, and the capital of his dream. But that dream wasn't limited to the city. Mehmed believed that the Ottomans were heirs to both the Roman and Islamic worlds. He styled himself not just as Sultan of the Muslims, but also as Caesar of Rome. In his mind, the conquest gave him legitimacy over both East and West. And his ambition didn't stop there. He dreamed of conquering Rome itself. He expanded his empire into the Balkans, the Black Sea region, and Anatolia. He built a navy powerful enough to rival Venice. He modernized the army, and he established laws and institutions that would guide the Ottoman Empire for centuries. What Mehmed created after the conquest wasn't just a city or an empire, it was a legacy. His conquest of Constantinople became one of the most significant moments in world history. It marked the true end of the Middle Ages and the dawn of a new era. It reshaped trade, faith, politics, and culture across continents. And even today, when you walk through the streets of Istanbul, from the Hagia Sophia to Topkapi Palace, you walk in the shadow of that vision. The vision of a 21-year-old who believed he could change history. And did.